The cold evening air on Fifth Avenue carried a distinct bite, a sharp contrast to the golden warmth spilling from the glass facade of Le Rêve. Inside the restaurant, a world of hushed laughter and clinking crystal unfolded behind the polished marble, a silent theater for New York's elite. Outside, the city's relentless hum felt distant, muted by the chilling wind that swept across the lonely pavement. James Harrison sat at a small, isolated outdoor table, a figure of immense wealth rendered invisible by his own design. The glow from the restaurant illuminated his tailored suit, but failed to penetrate the profound emptiness he carried. He was a man surrounded by the pinnacle of success, yet utterly stranded on an island of his own grief, scrolling absently through his phone, a barrier against a world he no longer wished to engage with. From the periphery of his insulated world, a small shape emerged from the urban shadows. She was a child, no older than 6, her clothes torn and her face smudged with the city's grime. Yet, beneath the layers of hardship, her eyes were enormous, pools of brown that held a startling mixture of fear and an unbroken, resilient hope. In her small hands, she clutched a worn teddy bear with the fierce grip of someone holding on to their last piece of the world. She moved with a quiet uncertainty, a ghost navigating a world that had long since stopped seeing her. She watched James from a distance, not with the calculating gaze of a seasoned panhandler, but with the searching eyes of a child looking for a safe harbor, for something she couldn't name but felt the absence of with every beat of her heart. She stopped beside his table, so silently that James didn't notice her until she spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper, a fragile sound nearly lost to the wind. "Daddy, I'm hungry. Can you get me something to eat?" The word, Daddy, did not register as a mistake or a plea. It struck him like a physical blow, a lightning bolt that shattered the numb tranquility he had cultivated for years. The noise of Fifth Avenue vanished, the distant sirens, the murmur of conversations. The entire city went silent. In its place, he heard an echo, the voice of his own daughter, Lily, a ghost from a past he had buried under a mountain of work and wealth. The mask of indifference he wore cracked, and for the first time in nearly a decade, his eyes filled with a raw, undeniable pain. He looked up, and the world snapped back into focus. But it was different now. He didn't see a homeless girl. He saw the profound vulnerability and innocence in her eyes, a reflection of a loss so deep it had redefined him. The hushed whispers and shocked stares from nearby patrons were meaningless static. His entire being was consumed by this one impossible moment. It's in these unexpected collisions of pain and purity that the true measure of a person is revealed. If you believe in the power of stories that capture these raw, life-altering moments, subscribing is one of the best ways to ensure we can continue to bring them to light. James felt a pull, an instinct that overrode years of self-imposed isolation, a desperate need to answer a call he thought he would never hear again. He led her past the stunned maitre d', whose protests died in his throat under the weight of James's gaze. It was not a look of anger, but of a profound, shattering grief that commanded obedience more effectively than any threat. They sat at a pristine table draped in white linen, a small, grimy island in a sea of polished elegance. The whispers followed them, a chorus of disapproval and morbid curiosity from the surrounding tables. Patrons glanced over their menus and wine glasses, their expressions a mixture of pity and disdain. For Sophie, the world had shrunk to the warm bread placed before her, which she devoured with a desperation that silenced the entire room. For James, the world had shrunk to this one small child, a fragile ghost from his past who had suddenly, impossibly become his present. The weight of their collective stares was nothing compared to the weight of her innocent, hungry eyes. The silence between them was thick with unspoken histories. James fumbled through the menu, its cursive French a foreign language he could no longer decipher. He simply pointed to the filet mignon, assuming it was a safe, substantial choice, and asked the waiter to bring a glass of milk. Sophie watched the server with wide, cautious eyes, her small hands clutching the worn teddy bear on her lap, its button eyes a silent witness to this surreal turn of events. She ate with a focused intensity, each bite a victory against the gnawing hunger that had been her constant companion. She didn't marvel at the taste or the tenderness of the meat. She was simply filling an emptiness that had defined her existence. James didn't eat, he just watched, his own appetite replaced by a tidal wave of memories threatening to pull him under. Every small gesture she made was a painful echo of a life he had lost. The way she carefully cut a small piece of steak, her tongue sticking out in concentration, was an exact replica of a memory he had locked away. He saw Lily, not in a five-star restaurant, but in a cheap roadside diner on a family trip years ago. She was 6 then, too, her face a mess of chocolate milkshake, her laughter filling the small booth with a light that had long since been extinguished. The memory was so vivid it felt like a phantom limb, an ache for something that was gone forever. He felt a tear trace a cold path down his cheek, the first he had shed in nearly a decade. He wasn't just feeding a hungry child. He was trying to feed a starving part of his own soul. He finally found his voice, a rough, unused thing. "What's your name?" he asked, his tone softer than he intended. She looked up from her plate, a bit of food on her cheek, and answered in a voice as small as she was. "Sophie." The name was simple, beautiful, and it hung in the air between them. He pushed forward, needing to understand. "Your parents. Where are they?" Sophie's focus dropped back to her plate. She didn't cry or offer a story. She simply shook her head, a silent, definitive gesture that spoke of an abandonment so complete it needed no words. In that small, heartbreaking motion, James saw a loneliness that mirrored his own, a shared void that transcended the gulf of wealth and circumstance that separated them. Instead of taking her to a shelter or calling the authorities, James did the most irrational thing he had done in his adult life. He took her home. His penthouse was a monument to emptiness, a sprawling space of glass, steel, and cold marble overlooking Central Park. It was less a home and more a gallery for a life devoid of warmth or connection. Sophie stood in the cavernous living room, clutching her bear, a tiny figure dwarfed by the scale of his wealth. The floor-to-ceiling windows displayed the glittering city below like a collection of jewels, but she paid them no mind. Her eyes were fixed on the sterile silence, the lack of clutter, the absence of life. To her, this palace was more intimidating than any dark alley, its pristine quiet more deafening than the city's roar. She was a wildflower transplanted into a sterile greenhouse, and he had no idea how to help her bloom. The consequences of his impulsive act arrived swiftly. The story became a media sensation, a bizarre spectacle for public consumption. Headlines screamed from tabloids and news sites. Reclusive billionaire's bizarre new obsession. From penthouse to pity, his business partners called, their voices thick with a feigned concern that barely masked their panic over the company's image and stock price. He was no longer seen as a brilliant, if eccentric, titan of industry, but as an unstable man teetering on the edge of a breakdown. The judgment was relentless, a storm of criticism from a world that couldn't comprehend an act born not of logic, but of pure, unadulterated pain. He had spent years building an impenetrable fortress of wealth and power, and in one night, a 6-year-old girl had breached its walls completely. Inside that fortress, James was fighting a war with himself. He was terrified. He had forgotten the simple rhythms of caring for a child. He bought her a room full of expensive toys she never touched and beautiful dresses she seemed afraid to wrinkle. He struggled to know what to say when she woke up crying from nightmares she couldn't explain. A gnawing guilt began to eat at him. Was this an act of compassion Or was it the ultimate selfishness? Was he using this vulnerable, broken child as a substitute for the daughter he'd lost, trying to fill the gaping hole in his own life at her expense? Sometimes it feels like the world asks too much of us, to carry our own pain and then take on someone else's. If you've ever felt that struggle, subscribing to our channel helps us continue to explore these deeply human stories. Sophie, too, was struggling to navigate this strange new world. The constant quiet of the apartment was unnerving. On the streets, the noise of the city was a lullaby, a sign that she was not alone. Here, the silence was a heavy blanket that smothered her. She missed the familiar comfort of sleeping huddled against other children, the shared warmth a shield against the cold and the dark. She was clean, fed and safe, but she was also profoundly isolated. She would flinch whenever James moved too quickly or spoke too loudly, her body conditioned by a life of constant threat. Their connection was a fragile thread woven from shared grief, but it was being stretched to its breaking point by the chasm between their pasts and the uncertainty of their future. The outside world soon breached the penthouse doors in the form of Child Protective Services. A woman named Ms. Albright, with tired eyes and a clipboard that felt like a weapon, sat across from him in his sterile living room. Her questions were sharp, clinical, and laced with suspicion. She saw a reclusive, emotionally detached billionaire, not a potential savior. She noted the lack of any real childproofing, the absence of warmth, the sheer inappropriateness of the environment. James tried to explain, but his words felt hollow, inadequate. He couldn't articulate the profound spiritual pull he felt towards Sophie. To Miss Albright, he was just a rich man playing with a human doll. And the unspoken threat hung in the air. He was not fit to care for her. The pressure became too much for Sophie. One morning, James woke to a silence that was different, deeper and more final. He walked into her room to find the bed perfectly made, the expensive toys untouched. On the pillow lay the new clothes he had bought her, neatly folded. The only thing missing was Sophie and her worn teddy bear. The sight was a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. It was a reenactment of his worst nightmare, a confirmation of his deepest fear, that he was fundamentally broken, destined to be abandoned by anyone he dared to love. The vast, empty penthouse, once his sanctuary, was now a tomb, its silence screaming his failure. He had lost a daughter all over again. In the crushing despair, something unexpected happened. The old James Harrison would have crumbled. He would have retreated into his work, building his walls higher and thicker, letting the grief turn to stone in his chest. But the man who stood in that empty room was different. The brief, fragile light Sophie had brought into his life had illuminated the depths of his own prison, and he found he was no longer willing to reside there. A flicker of defiance sparked within him. This wasn't about replacing Lily anymore. This was about Sophie. It was about a little girl who deserved a safe harbor. And he was damned if he would let his own brokenness be the storm that drove her away. He didn't call his security team or hire a private investigator. He shed the skin of the billionaire CEO and became simply a father searching for his child. He walked the streets of the city, not as an observer from a chauffeured car, but as a participant in its gritty reality. He went to every shelter, every soup kitchen, showing Sophie's picture to faces that were usually invisible to him. He saw the world she came from, a world of hardship and resilience he had never known. He felt the biting wind, saw the desperation in people's eyes, and understood her fear. The search for Sophie became a pilgrimage, a journey not just through the city's underbelly, but into the heart of his own humanity. He was finally leaving the island of his grief and learning to navigate the world again. Days bled into a relentless cycle of hope and despair. James walked until his designer shoes were scuffed and his feet ached with a pain he welcomed, a physical distraction from the screaming void in his chest. He learned the geography of the forgotten, the network of shelters and soup kitchens that formed the city's hidden heart. He spoke to people whose gazes usually slid right past him, showing them a photo of Sophie. His voice raw with a desperation they understood all too well. He was no longer a name on a building or a figure in a financial report. He was just a man searching for a child. Sometimes the hardest journeys are the ones we take inside ourselves, learning to fight for something again after we've lost all hope. If these are the stories that move you, subscribing is the best way you can help us keep telling them. The lead came from a weary shelter worker who recognized Sophie's picture and pointed him toward a series of back alleys a few blocks away, a place where the most vulnerable children often hid. He found her there, tucked into a small alcove behind a dumpster, a tiny ball of misery against the cold, damp brick. The alley smelled of rain and decay, a stark contrast to the sterile perfection of his penthouse. She was clutching her worn teddy bear, her small shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The city's cacophony seemed to fade, replaced by the sound of her quiet, heartbreaking grief. She looked smaller than he remembered, a fragile ship lost in a storm, and he felt a protective ache so fierce it nearly brought him to his knees. He had found her, but the chasm between them felt wider than ever. He didn't call out her name, afraid the sound would shatter the fragile stillness and send her running. Instead, he approached slowly, his steps measured and soft on the grimy pavement. He was a trespasser in her world of shadows, and he knew he had to earn her trust all over again. When he was a few feet away, he stopped and slowly lowered himself to his knees, heedless of the dirt and grime staining his expensive suit. It wasn't a calculated gesture. It was an instinctual act of surrender. He stripped himself of all authority, all power, becoming just a man kneeling in an alley, his face etched with a pain and sincerity she could not mistake. He held out his empty hands, a silent offering, showing her he had no intention of cornering her, only of connecting with her. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a ragged whisper, thick with unshed tears. "Sophie," he began, his gaze locked on her wide, fearful eyes. "I know I'm not your real father, but I want to be." He paused, swallowing against the lump in his throat, letting the raw truth of his words hang in the cold air between them. "I already lost a daughter once, and I can't lose you too. Please," he pleaded, the word cracking with the full weight of his broken heart. "Please, let me be your family." It was not a promise of wealth or a comfortable life, but a simple, desperate plea for a chance to love again, to build something new from the wreckage of their shared loneliness. In his vulnerability, he offered her the one thing he had never been able to give anyone else, his whole shattered heart. For a long moment, she just stared at him, her tear-filled eyes searching his face, looking for the trick, the lie, the inevitable disappointment. But she found none. She saw only a reflection of her own profound loss, a man as broken and lonely as she was. Slowly, hesitantly, she pushed herself to her feet. She took one small step, then another, until she was standing right in front of him. Then, with a quiet sob that seemed to carry all the pain of her short life, she launched herself into his arms. James wrapped his arms around her small, trembling body, burying his face in her matted hair as his own tears finally fell freely. In the filth of a forgotten alley, surrounded by the city's indifference, two broken souls clung to each other, their silent embrace sealing the promise of a new beginning. The legal process of adoption was a sterile affair of paperwork and courtrooms, a world of cold bureaucracy that stood in stark contrast to the messy, emotional journey that had brought them there. James, once a master of such environments, found himself nervous, his hands fidgeting with a pen as he sat beside Sophie in a judge's chambers. Ms. Albright was there, but her eyes were no longer tired with suspicion. They held a quiet, professional respect. When the judge finally stamped the papers and declared Sophia Harrison, the sound was a quiet thud that echoed like a gunshot in the silent room, marking the end of one life and the definitive start of another. James looked at Sophie, whose small hand was tucked securely in his, and saw not a ghost of his past, but the bright, hopeful face of his future. He was no longer just her guardian, he was her father, a title he now accepted not with grief, but with profound, humbling joy. The penthouse, once a monument to James's isolation, underwent a radical transformation. The cold marble floors were now softened by colourful rugs, chosen by Sophie for their wild patterns and bright hues. Her drawings, vibrant and full of life, were taped proudly to the minimalist walls, a chaotic and beautiful rebellion against the sterile order he had once cherished. Laughter, a sound long absent from those halls, now echoed freely, chasing away the ghosts of silence. He reduced his hours at the office, trading board meetings for afternoons in the park, teaching her how to ride a bike with the same focus he once reserved for stock market analysis. The expensive toys he had first bought her were eventually replaced by worn-out storybooks and a well-loved art set. His house was no longer a gallery of wealth. It was a home, messy and alive and filled with the unmistakable warmth of a family finally being built. His journey with Sophie had opened his eyes to a part of the city he had never truly seen, and he could not turn away. He liquidated assets, redirected investments, and poured his immense resources into creating the New Beginning Foundation. It was not a faceless charity run by a board of directors, but his personal mission. He was there, on the ground, overseeing the construction of shelters that felt like homes, not institutions, and developing educational programs that nurtured not just minds, but broken spirits. He wanted to give other children the same chance Sophie had given him, the chance to be seen. It's a reminder that one person's story can inspire a wave of change that touches so many others. Thank you for being part of this journey with us. Subscribing ensures we can continue to share these powerful accounts of hope and transformation. His fortune was no longer a shield, but a tool to build a legacy of compassion. Years later, James found that the gnawing emptiness inside him had been replaced by a quiet, steady peace. He discovered that the purpose of his life wasn't to accumulate wealth or power, but to give and receive love in its purest form. He was no longer the haunted figure on Fifth Avenue, but a man who smiled easily, whose eyes held a light that had been missing for over a decade. He learned that family wasn't defined by blood, but by the conscious choice to show up, to care, and to open a shattered heart to the terrifying, beautiful possibility of healing. In saving Sophie, he had finally, truly, saved himself. He had not replaced the daughter he lost, but he had learned to live again, building a new future on the foundation of a love he never expected to find.